So today we're going to be talking about positive and negative numbers. And so up to now, we've probably only been working with positive numbers, things that are bigger than zero. Well, now we're going to also include all of the numbers that are less than zero. So basically, we're just going to count away from the number zero. -7, -8, -9, -10. So as I move to further to the right, things are positive, and as I move further to the left, things are negative. Now, as with a lot of types of numbers, that there's actually, I think the best way of saying this is uh, it's also really important to note which one is going to be bigger. So if I were to pick, say, two positive numbers, say I had like 4 and 9, where what determines what is larger is, well, 9 is bigger than 4. 9 is greater than 4. And if you take a look at their relative position on the number line, we note that, yeah, 9 is further to the right on the number line. So it's greater than 4. Now, another thing that we can take a look at is, well, what happens if I take something like -6 and -1? 6 we tend to think of as larger, but if I take a look on my number line, 6 is further to the left on the number line than, say, -1. So -1 is, in fact, larger. My smaller number is down here. So things that are further to the left on the number line are less than things that are further to the right on the number line. If I were to do something, if I were to take a look at, say, I took a look at 4 and -10. 4 is here, and -10 was down here. -10 is much further to the left on the number line. It looks like 10 might be larger, but 4 is in fact larger. So this is some things to pay attention to when you're looking on a number line. And note that every single positive number is always going to be larger than a negative number. Other things that you can look at when you're looking at number lines, or when you're looking at things, is what we call an absolute value. An absolute value is this. An absolute value basically is looking at how far away a number is from zero. Is the number from zero? So it doesn't care about positive or negative. It just cares about how big. So if I've got something like 0 and say I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I'll do 1, 2, 3, 4, -5. If I were to take a look at the absolute value of -5, I'm not looking back at this as like moving backwards. I only care about the length of this thing. This is 5 long, so the absolute value of -5 is 5. Doesn't matter that this is moving to the right, I only care about the length of this segment. So the absolute value of 5 is still 5. And this notation of putting a number in between pipes, it usually says you're going to evaluate what's inside here first. Is this positive or it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, it just says how big is this number? This is 5 large. Some other things with our notation about with uh, with regards to positive and negative numbers. And that has to do with what happens when I start putting a negative sign in front of a number? We can also think of the negative sign as the opposite. So if I say 3, 3 is right here. If I were to take a look at -3, put a negative in front of that 3, it becomes a -3. If I were to start at this -3 and then take another and then put a negative in front of that, it reverses it. So I can think of a negative sign as reversing the position and of reflecting something around this 0. So the opposite of 3 is -3. The opposite of -3 is a +3. And something that you might notice is that if I've got 2 of these, you might have heard before that 2 negatives make a positive. 2 negatives, in fact, can cancel each other. So whenever you see a negative and a negative, this is just going to be equal to a positive number. However, be careful, because if I've got something like, if you have multiple layers of this, then it can get tricky. One of the ways that you could do this, if I have, say, no absolute values, is you could just count this up. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of these. If you've got an even, if I have an even number of negatives, this will make a positive. If I have an odd number, that would be negative. And essentially what happens, we always evaluate this from the inside out, -5, opposite of a -5 would be a +5. Opposite of 5 is going to be -5. Opposite of a -5 is a +5. So pairs of negatives cancel each other out. Leaves us with a positive number. The caution here is, as soon as I have an absolute value in here, then things start to change. Remember, we evaluate things from the inside out. So the absolute value of -5 is just 5. And I have that negative outside that. So this is the opposite. So this negative, this is essentially the opposite of this 5. And now I've got the opposite of -5 is a +5. And the opposite of a +5 is -5. So you have to watch your absolute values. So when you're evaluating whether a number is positive or negative, especially when you've got multiples of these, if you don't have any absolute values, just count them up. If it's even, if it's an even number, you've got a positive. If it's an odd number, you've got a negative, because pairs of negatives will cancel each other out. However, if you've got an absolute value, evaluate that absolute value first and then see what you've got. Once we evaluated this absolute value, I found I had 3 negatives, and that indeed comes out to be a negative. So -5. Alrighty, that's all I've got for this. So I will catch you in the next video.